On some small cabinets, depending on the type of hinge you're using, you would start the hinging process before the carcass is assembled. But when you're using little butt hinges like these, the hinging of the doors is a process that happens after the carcass of the cabinet is assembled. I measured the width of the cabinet, and now I'm cutting the doors to the right width to fit. I cut off the nibs first, and now I want to trim on the opposite side just a little bit rather than make my inside stiles any narrower than they are. Now that the doors are cut to width, I'll trim them to length using the sled. You always want to size the doors after the cabinet is made. You want to make certain of your exact measurements. Now I'll fit the hinges. To hang these doors, I'm going to use butt hinges, and I'll show you two ways to install them. One is the traditional way where you use a marking gauge, mallet and chisel, and the other is a technique using the router. I make a little template like this that's exactly sized to fit the hinge. So I want to install this hinge, and I'm going to start by showing you the traditional technique. First, I mark it there, and on the other side of the hinge I want to mark where the other part of the hinge will go. My pencil mark, and the hinge should be in perfect alignment. Then I have to use my square, mark there and there, so I have my start and stop points. And between those start and stop points, I'll take my marking gauge, which is set for the size of the leaf, and I'll pull it between points. And I'll go a little bit deeper because I'm going to use that as a chisel, so my chisel will rest in that point. Now the other thing I use my marking gauge for is for setting the depth. So it's set so it's just a little less than half the thickness of the barrel. That's my mark for my depth. This is the mark for the back side of the hinge, and I'll use a chisel to cut my pencil marks. Right on the inside of the pencil line and cut down. I'll do the same thing on the inside of the pencil line here. I can always expand it later if I want to. I just loosen things up a little bit so it doesn't distort my line when I make the cut along the marking gauge line. So I just... And now, I want to start making a series of cuts down to this marking gauge line. So I can lay the point of my chisel into that marking gauge line. And I'm going to observe carefully that I don't lift anything out where I don't want to remove material. I want to be able to take my hinge and observe that it fits. And I do the same thing on the door. So I have a little bit of clearance at the top and at the bottom for the door to swing open. And I can line the door up where I want it. And then I'll simply mark where my hinge is to go. I'll use the same process with the marking gauge and the chisels to remove the waste. Now I want to show you another way to install butt hinges using an easy-to-make jig that you can make for yourself. I start out by cutting pieces of Baltic birch to exactly surround the hinge. Distance from one end of the hinge to the other is 1.5 inches. So that's the distance I set the sled from the stop block to the blade. I'll cut 2 pieces that dimension. And this is about 9/16. This dimension isn't quite as critical, so I can actually make it a little bit larger. I'll go 5/8. I'm going to cut 2 pieces that dimension. So you can see I'm boxing in around it. Now, to start building a little log cabin shape around this, I'm going to need 2 pieces, 3 5/8. And I'm going to need 2 pieces, 4 1/2. So you can see I have the basic shape of the hinge. It's rectangular. I put it in there and line pieces up, slide this in, slide that in, same here, and same here. And you can see that what I've essentially done is I've built a log cabin perfectly defining the shape of the hinge. The thing I want to do is begin using brad nails, slide that tight to attach all the pieces together so they stay as an integral log cabin cornered shape. And when you install a butt hinge, you want to have about that much of the barrel sticking out from the door so that the door can operate freely. I control that by the placement of this strip on the jig. So I can observe on the hinge the edge there where it's mortised into the door to someplace in here. This would be the amount of the barrel that would be exposed. And so if that's the line where I want it, I would want to make sure that this distance here and this distance here are exactly the same. I can clamp this down and put a screw in there and a screw in there to hold it in place. So the jig is almost complete. I have a router bit in this trim router that has a bearing at the top and the cutter at the bottom. The bearing and the cutter are exactly the same diameter. And so this bearing will ride around on the inside of the jig while the cutter goes down and cuts into this piece that I use as a clamping strip. And then I'll be able to mark exactly where the center is so I can align this wherever I want to align the center of a hinge. I want the final depth setting to be almost 1/2 the thickness of the hinge barrel. Now I can mark where the halfway point is. So there's a 1 inch mark there, 2 1/2 mark there, the 3/4 right here is the center line for the hinge. So this will become my alignment mark every time I want to set this on the door or the cabinet side. So I mark it here on this edge, but I turn it over here and continue that mark to give myself a permanent reference in case in the use of this, some of that mark gets erased by sawdust moving around. In order to use this jig, all I have to do is make a single mark. And so I'll measure, and where I mark will become the center line of the hinge. I line the center line of the jig with the mark that I just made. And I'll clamp this in place. And I'll make sure that the jig is down even on the cabinet sides and tightly held in place. I'm using a laminate trimmer, and in the laminate trimmer I have a router bit that has a bearing that follows the inside surface of the jig. It's set to the depth that I want the hinge mortise. So before I remove the jig, I want to hold the chisel into the corner, and I'll tap and square the corners of the cut. That gives me a tight fit. So now I can route the hinge mortises on the other side of the cabinet. Then I can sand the doors, and next I will route the mortises for the hinges to fit the doors, and then they will be ready to hang on the cabinet. Do all my measuring from the bottom so it all comes out the same. So that's 3 1/4. And I want it to be a little closer so that the door is lifted slightly to provide clearance. So if this is 3 3/4 to the center, I'll come here 3 3/4 and come back a 1/16. And that 1/16 will become my clearance at the bottom. Okay, this other one was marked at 18. So I'll come back to 17 15/16. And again, that will provide my clearance at the bottom. I'll mark the other door the same way. So I'm going to take my jig and align it with my pencil mark. So now I'm going to use a clamp to hold the jig in place, held tight. I want to see that this is flush here and here. So after I do that 3 more times, I'll be done. Now this side's ready to screw in, but I want to do a little decorative routing on the edges. I'm going to use a chamfering bit to go with the chamfer that I've cut on the inside edges. So I'll do that on both sides. Now with just a little more sanding, I'll be ready to hang the doors. I always install the hinges to the doors first because the doors are hard to handle trying to drill against them if you're already holding them against the cabinet. I always try to orient everything the same direction so that here I've got the part with 2 barrels. This has 3. I'll put the 3 parts on the cabinet and the 2-part knuckle on the door. I have a VIX bit which is self-centering, and so what I have to do is hold it in the hole and drill. It's important to have your screwdriver sized to fit the screw. And I always dip them in wax so that when they go in, they'll go in a little easier and have less likelihood of breaking off. Now that I have the hinges mounted to the doors, I can begin connecting them to the cabinet. So I use a VIX bit and drill a hole. That's how you install butt hinges.